Hi class, welcome to lesson 3 of unit 7. We are going to continue to talk about the major events of the Civil War. Uh, and in this one, I will talk briefly about how conditions were for the average soldier, and I'll talk about how the economies of both the northern states and the federal government and then the Confederacy, how their economies hold up as the war progresses, and then I'll dive into the battles. And one thing that you need to be aware of is that, yet again, one of the big challenges for Abraham Lincoln isn't necessarily winning battles, it is keeping the Northern morale up enough for the Northern citizens to support him in his efforts to finish the war. Now, remember, at this point, the war is also, it's not just about preserving the Union, but it's also about eliminating slavery, at least in the rebelling states. And so that has added a moral cause to the war, and that did boost Northern morale for a time. But as the war progresses, especially after Gettysburg, the morale of the Northern citizens is going to start to sink again, and Lincoln's going to have to find a way to boost Northern morale in order for them to support him enough to finish out the job. Okay, so first let's talk about what what life was like for the average soldier during the war. And one thing to note is that however bad it was for a Union soldier, it's going to be even worse for a Confederate soldier because the Confederacy struggled more to get supplies to their soldiers. So soldiers were often very low on supplies, especially if you were a Confederate soldier. Oftentimes they had to sleep on the dirt. You can see in this picture here what the living conditions might be like in some of their camps. Sometimes they would be without blankets in the cold. They would oftentimes be marching, especially if you're a Confederate soldier and you don't have many trains to transport you. And so people oftentimes, their shoes wore out, and sometimes they were without shoes. And marching without shoes is going to be very difficult. You see, this soldier has shoes. This one here apparently does not. Of course, he could have just taken them off to rest. But the point is, marching without shoes is going to be difficult, and that's going to be a big problem that the Confederacy faces more than the Union does. Food is oftentimes going to be scarce. It's going to be hard to get food to soldiers near these battlefields, and oftentimes they had to resort to a very simple type of food known as hardtack, which is little more than crackers. And basically, what they would do is they would mix flour and water, and it would create this kind of doughy uh, food with, if they were lucky, they could add some bacon grease for some flavor, but otherwise it was not very tasty, and they're eating this over and over again, and it's not very nutritious. And if you're burning thousands of calories marching or fighting, you're going to need more nutrition than you're getting from these desperate food sources like hardtack. And again, the Confederate soldiers are going to be struggling more than the Union soldiers, but the Union soldiers often had to deal with this sort of thing as well. Keep in mind that even though this was the bloodiest battle, or excuse me, the bloodiest war in American history, at least up to this point, it was disease that killed more soldiers than anything else. Oftentimes they would die as a result of surgeries that occurred after battles, but oftentimes they died because of the unsanitary conditions. Oftentimes they're exposed to the elements for weeks on end, and that's going to take a toll on the human body. They're going to struggle to find clean water, and if you just drink water out of a stream, uh, it's very likely to have parasites in it. It's very likely to have things that can make you sick. And if you're already malnourished, you add on to that a disease, there's a good chance that you're going to die. So one thing to note about this war is that as bloody as it was because of the weapons, disease is going to be the number one killer of soldiers in this war, oftentimes because they were malnourished and they were unable to get safe drinking water. Remember, I said before that battlefield medicine was not very advanced. They did not have knowledge of germs. They did not understand that you needed to have sanitary tools whenever you perform things like amputations. And so oftentimes the doctors themselves made things worse whenever they attempted to provide battlefield medicine to those that were injured. There in the pictures, you can see a couple of people that did survive the war, and you can see that they did have to have limbs amputated. But remember that oftentimes these people would die because there would be an infection that would follow soon after an amputation, and then they would die because of that. There were a myriad of diseases that hurt soldiers. Uh, you had dysentery, which would be related to drinking bad water. You would have pneumonia, which would be related to being exposed to the elements for long periods of time. And remember, if you're in the outdoors and it's raining on a regular basis, you're going to get cold. If you're cold and wet for a very long time, you're more likely to get diseases. Uh, I've gone backpacking myself and had to struggle through some similar situations. Luckily, never for weeks on end, like some of these soldiers did. You'll see also gangrene is going to be a problem, which is basically whenever your skin and your body starts to rot while still attached to your body. So there are lots of diseases that are killing soldiers. The battlefield medicine is not advanced enough to do a whole lot of good, and the camp conditions were pretty terrible. Now, if you combine these bad, unhealthy conditions with the fact that you're also physically exerting yourself while marching or fighting, while you're also being malnourished because food supplies are low, that's going to take a heavy psychological toll. And then if you add all that together on top of the fact that every once in a while you are engaged in a battle where you are fighting for your life, this is going to be very difficult, psychologically speaking. So many soldiers are going to suffer from what we call today post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This was not really a recognized thing at the time, so far as I know. Oftentimes, if you're suffering from PTSD and you became psychologically unable to really fight like a normal person would fight, people would consider you to be a coward, and they might say, go back out there and fight anyways, which is just going to worsen your PTSD. And so a lot of soldiers are going to come out of this war with serious psychological problems. If they survive the war, they'll have emotional issues, they'll have mental health issues, and many of those are not going to be very well recognized at the time. Other soldiers, it's interesting, it's almost like they lost their humanity, and there is this concept of hardening where they basically saw death, they saw violence, they saw gore so much that it stopped affecting them. And that's a fairly scary thing to think about if you get to the point where violence and death doesn't faze you anymore. I've heard this one story about these two soldiers that were fighting. And they were in some sort of trench or ditch, kind of like what you see in the picture here. And they had stopped to eat a meal, and the enemy was nearby. And both of them had their plates of food out, and then one of them stuck their heads up too high and literally had his head blown off or his brains blown out by a bullet, and the guy's brains ended up falling into his friend's plate of food. So what did the friend that survived do? He set his plate of food aside and took the plate of food of his dead friend and kept on eating as if nothing had happened. So that is obviously not normal, but that's the sort of thing that happened to some of these soldiers that experienced this sort of hardening where they became numb to this sort of violence. Some, again, suffered PTSD in the sense that they were emotionally frayed and fragile and had flashbacks after the war. Some of them became almost inhuman in that they were so hardened by the war because of all that they had seen. Regardless, the war was brutal, not just physically, but also psychologically. Okay, now on to the subject of the economies of both the Confederate States and the Union States. I'll talk about the Union first. So the Union economy during the war is actually going to do fairly well. There is a strong need for weapons, and so the factories that had been built during the First Industrial Revolution are going to be operating pretty much at full capacity. And so there'll be high demand for weapons coming out of these factories, and as a result, these factories are going to be giving lots of employment to lots of people. They're going to be producing lots of stuff for the war, so the Northern economy is going to be booming. Now, if you look at the picture on the left, you'll notice that many of the people working in this particular factory are women. And that's important to note because remember that lots of the men were fighting in the war, so when the men had to go fight in the war, it left a lot of job openings uh, that needed to be filled. And those job openings are going to be filled largely with women. And that's an important thing to note. You might want to start and highlight that last bullet there. Women working in the factories is a non-traditional role for women. Remember that the role of the woman was supposed to be, if they were married especially, in the home. And now all of a sudden they are doing what's considered to be quote unquote man's work during the war, and they are doing a successful job of providing the weapons that the Northern soldiers needed for the war. And so, what that's going to do is it's going to empower women. You will see after the Civil War, in the years after the Civil War, women feel empowered by the fact that they took on traditionally male roles, and you will see the women's rights movement resume. It will have limited success in the years right after the Civil War, but by the time you get to World War I, and women do the same thing again in factories during World War I, you'll see women get the right to vote. And that'll be in 1920. You'll learn about that in American history too. Another thing that helps the Northern economy that I don't have mentioned in the notes is that with the southern states gone, the federal government is able to pass higher tariffs that protect the American businesses from foreign competition, and the South's not there to stop those tariffs from being passed. And so that will also help the Northern economy do well. The Southern economy is not going to do well. So the Southern economy is going to be struggling terribly, and largely that's going to be because the Anaconda Plan is pretty effective. The Anaconda Plan is going to cut off the majority of trade that the Confederacy was conducting with foreign nations. Remember that Britain does not join them in the war once the war has a second theme, that being about freeing slaves. Also, you will see the destruction of railroads. I've already talked about some of that. And whenever you combine the fact that the Confederacy can't trade with other nations and the fact that it's starting to lose its railroads, and by the way, I'm about to get to it, the part where it loses the Mississippi River, it's going to be very hard to get supplies into the Confederacy. And even if you get supplies into the Confederacy from another country, it's going to be very hard to transport them throughout the Confederacy because of the impending loss of the Mississippi River and because of the destruction of Southern railroads. So when you have a shortage of supplies, like food, for example, you're going to see the prices of these items go up. And that is, if you've taken a civics class, you know that is called inflation. When prices rise, you have what's known as inflation. And whenever you have more demand for a product than you have a supply for a product, you'll see inflation occur. And that's exactly what's happening as a result of the Anaconda Plan. So for example, if you look at this chart here, I always call this your average grocery store visit. If you look in 1860, this is what an average bill might be once you go to the grocery store and get things like maybe bacon, flour, sugar, coffee, tea, etc. Just a few years later, as the Anaconda Plan takes effect, look at how the price of things goes up. Coffee goes up by a factor of 40, from 50 cents to $20 for 4 pounds of it. And if you look overall, the impact of the Anaconda Plan, this is the price of maybe your average grocery store visit in 1863 versus before the war started. Food costs 10 times more than it did before. So imagine if all of a sudden your family had to spend 10 times more per week to buy groceries. That's the sort of thing that the Confederacy is facing because the Anaconda Plan is proving to be effective. And I'm not finished talking about the Anaconda Plan because I have more talk to do about the Mississippi River being taken, and I have more talk to do about the taking of railroads and the destruction of railroads. So things get so desperate that in some places you have riots breaking out over food. You have, for example, what's known as the famous bread riots. I believe they took place in Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. And you had women who were desperate for food, and they were breaking into grocery stores. You see here a bakery is being broken into by these women. You see this woman is taking a loaf of bread home. You have what were known as the bread riots. So women desperate to feed their families, desperate to feed themselves, are going to start rioting in some places. Now, when this happened in Richmond, the story is that Jefferson Davis himself came out to the streets and started throwing his own money at these women and saying, blame the Union for this. Here's some money. Don't go rioting. And when that didn't calm the women down, he actually had to bring in troops with guns to threaten to kill the women to get them to disperse. So things are getting increasingly desperate for the Confederacy, though they have not given up yet. You will see some Confederate soldiers leave the battlefields. They'll desert their military to go take care of their families whenever they hear that their families are starving. And in the end, the Confederate government, because it was weak, because it was a confederacy, could not do much to help stop the economy that was crashing all around them. So again, this idea that the Confederacy is weak comes into play. They can't really pass many laws in order to help with these problems. And I'm not sure if I've said this before, but I'll say it again. There was even this one time when Jefferson Davis, when things were getting tough, called for a national day of prayer and fasting. And the state of Georgia said, don't tell us what days to pray and fast on. We'll pick our own day. That's how weak the Confederate government was, is that its own states wouldn't listen to it even when they announced a national day of prayer. So if they can't agree on a national day of prayer, then you know that the Confederacy is not going to be able to save its crumbling economy. And remember that they've lost, or they're losing, slavery because of the Emancipation Proclamation, so that's going to make the economy weaken even more. And I still haven't gotten to the fulfillment of the entire Anaconda Plan. So things are getting worse and worse in the Confederacy in terms of their economy, which will affect their will to fight. I've already told you some soldiers are leaving the war to care for their families, but they're not giving up yet. And that's important because remember, the Confederacy just had to be willing to hold on for a little bit longer than the Northern citizens. And they will almost pull this off. More on that later. Okay, so remember when we get to the boxes related to battles, it's most important to highlight the parts that name the event and the significance of the event. So Vicksburg and Gettysburg are going to happen at virtually the same time. I'll talk about Vicksburg first, and a little bit later I'll talk about Gettysburg. So the Siege of Vicksburg is going to be the major turning point in the Western theater. It's going to happen in Mississippi, and this victory will be secured largely because of the leadership of General Grant. Now, if you look at the map here, you can see that after Grant had gone to Corinth to destroy railroads right after Shiloh, he had worked his way down the Mississippi River. You had other Union generals working their way up the Mississippi River, and in the end, Vicksburg is the last stronghold for the Confederacy. If the Confederacy loses Vicksburg, then they are going to lose control of the Mississippi River, and that part of the Anaconda Plan will be fulfilled for the Union. So Vicksburg, like I said, was a stronghold for the South. It was the last major stronghold for the South along the Mississippi River. In fact, if I remember correctly, Abraham Lincoln referred to it as the key. And if he could take that key, then he would have the Mississippi River and the Confederacy would be split in two. The problem for the Union, though, is that Vicksburg is very hard to take over because it is on the banks of the Mississippi River, and these banks are particularly high banks. It's hard to attack steep banks along a river. And if you go to the non-river side of Vicksburg, it's largely swampland. And so it's going to be very hard to get to. It is well positioned. It is also going to be heavily fortified because the Confederacy knew that they needed to keep Vicksburg. And Grant is going to try to attack twice, and he's going to fail twice. Now remember that Grant is very willing, if necessary, to lose men to win a battle, but he realizes that he's losing men for no reason by just trying to straight on attack Vicksburg. So what he will do is he will change his strategy. So rather than just try to invade a third time, instead he is going to surround the city and put it under siege. So when you put a place under siege, it means you surround it and you keep any supplies from leaving that area or any supplies from getting in. And you are literally going to starve those that you are surrounding into submitting. And so what happens again is Grant is going to surround the city. He is going to fire cannons into the city, fire cannonballs into the city on a regular basis to kind of remind the citizens of Vicksburg that he's still there. And the citizens of Vicksburg actually start to dig these underground little homes to try to protect themselves from the cannonballs that are coming in. These are known, or they become nicknamed prairie dog towns. Now, these prairie dog towns are no longer there. That house is still there. I did visit Vicksburg recently, and that house is still there. It did survive the war. These prairie dog towns are no longer visible. And Vicksburg is going to hold out for about 7 weeks. They are going to be incredibly desperate. They're going to be starving, nearly starving to death before they finally, and these are civilians largely, remember, these aren't soldiers, these are largely civilians that are very strong in their will to not give in to the Union, and they're going to hold out for 7 weeks before they finally surrender because they're again on the verge of starvation. Now, what's interesting is that the day that they give up is on July the 4th, on Independence Day. And the people of Vicksburg were so bitter about this that they refused to celebrate Independence Day again until World War II. Now, what's interesting is that I just so happened to visit Vicksburg last summer on Independence Day, and I will say they've gotten over it, and they were celebrating Independence Day again. But for a very long time, the people of Vicksburg were very bitter towards the Union for what happened during the siege. So the significance of the siege of Vicksburg is that now the Mississippi River is completely controlled by the Union. Again, this part of the Anaconda Plan has been fulfilled, and the Confederacy is split in half. And if you look at the map here, you can see it is color-coded, and basically it shows the territory held by the Union over time. And you can see here in 1863, on July the 4th, the Union now has the entire Mississippi River. And so part of the Confederacy is on one side of the Mississippi River, part of the Confederacy is on the other side of the Mississippi River. And you can see, if you look at the color coding, in 1864, the Confederacy will be split up again through Georgia. That will be Sherman's March to the Sea. I'll talk more about that in the next lecture. So at this point, the Confederacy is cut in half. Later on, it will be cut in half again. More on that later. And so this becomes the major turning point in the Western theater of the Civil War. At this point, the Western theater is pretty much controlled by the Union. The Mississippi River is literally controlled by the Union, and the Confederacy in the western part of its claimed country is going to be pretty much taken out by the Union. And what's going to happen after this is Grant is going to start to work his way back towards the east, and eventually around Chattanooga, around after the fighting in Chattanooga, he is going to be sent to fight against Lee, General Lee, and General Sherman is going to be sent to do his march through the South. More on that later on, but just remember at this point, basically the Western theater has been secured for the most part by the Union, and Grant is going to start, and Sherman are both going to start heading eastward towards the Eastern Theater. More on that later. Let's go to the Eastern Theater, and let's talk about what Robert E. Lee is doing with Stonewall Jackson, with his help, fighting in the Eastern Theater around the Washington, D.C. area. So there's a couple of battles that take place in Virginia. Remember that when we last left off with General Lee, he had been defeated, pretty much defeated at Antietam, and had managed to retreat back into Virginia and reassemble his army. Remember that General McClellan could have finished Lee off, but he didn't because he was too cautious, and he ultimately got fired as a result. So what's going to happen is you're going to see Lee get his momentum back, so much so, and get his confidence back up so much so that he's going to try to invade the Union again. And the second time he does so, he'll be even more successful than he was the first time, but ultimately he will be turned back, and that will be at the very significant Battle of Gettysburg. But first, let's talk about how Lee got his confidence and his men's confidence back up, their morale back up. So after McClellan was fired for the second and final time by Abraham Lincoln, President Lincoln, Ambrose Burnside is going to be put in charge to fight against General Lee and Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. And that will be the Battle of Fredericksburg. And Lee's army is going to be able to defeat Burnside because remember, Lee is one of the best generals, if not the best general in the entire war. But remember that Lee also had a very strong right-hand man in Stonewall Jackson. So Lee is going to be able to defeat Burnside, and whenever he fights in the Battle of Fredericksburg, Burnside is going to lose twice as many soldiers as Lee does, and so Lincoln is not going to be satisfied with Burnside either. And by the way, you can see where the term sideburn comes from if you look at General Burnside. So as a result of this, Lincoln is going to fire Burnside, and he is going to bring in another general, Joseph Hooker. And there you see him there at the bottom. Both of these generals fought under McClellan at Antietam. Hooker had been in the cornfield that I talked about, and that had been cut down by the bullet fire. And then Burnside had fought over control over the bridge over Antietam Creek. Well, both of these men that had fought under McClellan, both of them are going to be unsuccessful when it comes to fighting against Lee. And so you have a second battle, the Battle of Chancellorsville, and at this battle, Lee's army is going to defeat Hooker despite the fact that Lee had only half as many soldiers. Again, this is proving how strong and smart of a leader General Robert E. Lee is. This would be, imagine having a football game where you have, typically a football team has 11 players. Imagine having a team with only 6 players fighting against 11 and on the field at a time and still managing to win. This is how good Lee is as a general. So Hooker is also going to find himself fired. But there's a bad thing that happens at the end of this battle. So at the end of this battle, after it concluded and after the Confederacy had won again, Stonewall Jackson is going to go on a scouting mission to see where the Union has retreated to. And on his way back to the Confederate camp, he is going to, it's going to be at dusk, so it's going to be getting dark outside. And whenever he comes back towards the Confederacy, Confederate forces are going to mistake him for being a Union spy or a Union soldier, and they're going to start firing upon him. And by the time that they realize that it's Stonewall Jackson, he has been shot in the hand and he's been shot in the arm. He's going to be shot in his left arm so badly that they are going to have to amputate his arm. And like I said before, battlefield medicine was not very advanced. Stonewall Jackson, weakened from his amputation surgery, is going to get pneumonia, if I remember correctly, and die several days later. There you see a picture of Lee standing with the dying Stonewall Jackson. And Lee is not going to be happy about that. More on that in a moment. So remember that these are twin victories for the Confederacy under Lee and Stonewall Jackson's leadership. And Lee and his army at this point have gained so much confidence that they're going to decide to invade the Union again. Now remember that they're not invading the Union because they're trying to conquer the Union. They're invading the Union because if they make the war nasty enough and in the face enough of the Northern citizens, they'll turn on Lincoln, vote him out of office, and replace him with someone that will allow the South to either secede or keep their slaves or both. So again, his point of invasion is not to conquer the Union or not to conquer the northern states, but to turn the northern states against the war by basically bringing the war to their front yards. And again, this time he's not just going to manage to get into a border state, that being Maryland, like he did with Antietam. This time he's going to manage to get all the way into Pennsylvania. He's actually going to cross the Mason-Dixon line into a northern state. And that's where the Battle of Gettysburg will take place. However, he will be doing this without Stonewall Jackson because Stonewall Jackson dies shortly after Chancellorsville because of friendly fire. And so when Lee loses Jackson, there's a quote where Lee says something along the lines of, Jackson lost his left arm, but I have lost my right hand. Lee acknowledging the fact that he's lost his right-hand man, he's lost his best advisor, and some people have actually speculated that when Lee makes a very terrible, costly mistake at the Battle of Gettysburg, some people say that he made that mistake because he did not have the likes of Stonewall Jackson to advise him otherwise. And this leads us now to the most famous battle of the entire Civil War and the biggest battle of the entire Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg. So if you look at the map there, you can see that after Fredericksburg and after Chancellorsville, Lee and his men are going to be very confident. They're not going to worry about Washington, D.C. right now. They're not worried about trying to conquer that. And some people questioned Lee on why he didn't do that, but Lee felt it was more important to try to invade into the Union as far as he could, because again, the more that he made this war be in the front yards of the Northern citizens, the more real and nasty he made this war, the more likely the Northern citizens would be to turn on Lincoln. So Lee is going to be stopped at Gettysburg. Gettysburg will be the furthest north that the Confederate soldiers ever get, and this will be a major battle. It will be a 3-day battle, and it will take place, it will be the deadliest battle of the entire war. Antietam was the bloodiest and deadliest single day. If you add together the 3 days of Gettysburg, it is the biggest and bloodiest and deadliest battle of the war overall, and the bloodiest and deadliest battle ever fought on American soil, ever. So again, Lee is going to invade. He's going to make his way all the way up into southern Pennsylvania, and at this point he is going to be met with Hooker's replacement. So Hooker also was fired after he failed to defeat Lee, and so Lee is going to have to face a new general, George Meade. And this battle again will take place over 3 days. This battle is enormous. I could spend a lot of time talking about the different aspects of this battle. It'll take a long time. I've been to the battlefield for Gettysburg as well. It's about 25 square miles in size. It's enormous. But rather than get into all the details of the battle, I'll tell you about the major turning point of the battle, and that'll be on day 3. So by the 3rd day of the battle, you basically see the Union on a ridge known as Cemetery Ridge, which means they have high ground, which is advantageous. And there's also a stone wall going along this ridge. So not only do they have high ground, but they also have a stone wall on the high ground that they can kind of hide behind and shoot from behind if they need to. So what happens on the 3rd day is Robert E. Lee, again, he's going to be positioned basically on the other side of a field from Cemetery Ridge. He's on a different ridge called Seminary Ridge. And he is going to start firing heavily at the Union troops on Cemetery Ridge. And the mistake he makes is that he thinks that he has weakened the men on Cemetery Ridge. So he's going to basically fire lots of cannons towards Cemetery Ridge, towards the Union that has the high ground, and the Union's going to start firing back. And so you have this fight going across this field, and what Lee doesn't realize is that his cannonballs are actually shooting over the heads of the Union soldiers. They're actually missing their targets. And the reason he can't really tell that he's missing his targets is because this battle is so intense that the smoke created by the cannons kind of keeps him from being able to see what damage he's actually doing. And then on top of that, the Union general is going to come up with a plan to kind of bait Lee and his men out into the open. What the Union general is going to do is he's eventually going to tell his troops to stop firing back. And when they stop firing back, what Lee thinks has happened is that they have run out of ammunition, and now is a time to do a charge. They had not run out of ammunition. They had not been damaged by Lee's cannonballs, but they made Lee think that they had been damaged and that they were out of ammunition. So Lee thinks that it's pretty much safe to attack, which it's not. So this leads to Pickett's charge on the 3rd day. Lee is going to assemble a mile long line of 15,000 men to march across the field towards Cemetery Ridge. And this ends up being an enormous mistake because, again, the Union was not out of ammunition and the Union had not lost nearly as many soldiers as Lee thought because, again, he had overshot the ridge with many of his cannons. Whenever I think of Pickett's charge and 15,000 men marching in a mile-long line, I don't know how many of you have seen movies like the Lord of the Rings movies that have these epic battles, but I almost imagine that sort of scene, a mile-long line of 15,000 men marching. Now, again, they're marching towards an enemy, the Union in this case, that has the high ground and has a stone wall, ironically, to hide behind. And basically, once the Confederate soldiers get close enough, the Union is going to unleash their cannons, they're going to unleash their guns, and they're going to start mowing down the Confederate soldiers. And again, this does get very nasty. And about half of the men are going to be gunned down within 30 minutes. There are going to be Confederates that do make it all the way to the top of the ridge. Some of them actually do make it to that stone wall that's along the ridge. But by the time they got there, they are so weakened by being mowed down minutes earlier that they are going to be very easily defeated, and Lee is going to be forced to retreat. Now, what's interesting about this is that Lee was very revered by his men. They revered him so much that they thought under his leadership that they would be virtually invincible. And this is a point of overconfidence on their part. And what happens is that, again, Lee makes this mistake. He might not have made this mistake had Stonewall Jackson still been alive to advise him otherwise. Some of his own generals, I think, thought that this was a bad idea, but none of them had the guts to tell Lee that they thought so because of the respect that they had for Lee. Interestingly, after the battle concludes and after the Confederacy is defeated, Lee is going to go to his men saying, "It's all my fault, boys. It's all my fault." He will take the blame for this. So, what is the significance of this battle? This battle is the biggest battle of the entire Civil War with 51,000 casualties. And remember, a casualty doesn't necessarily mean a death. It means dead or missing or injured. It means you're not able to fight anymore for one reason or another. And this battle was huge. There were 75,000 Union troops in this battle. There were 50,000 Confederate troops in this battle. So that's a total of 125,000 people fighting in this battle. If you've ever been to the Carolina Panthers football stadium, this would be more than the full capacity of the Carolina Panthers football stadium, all fighting in a single battle. This is enormous in terms of magnitude, in terms of how many people are fighting. And then after the battle, of the 125,000 people that fought, there are 51,000 casualties. And Lee loses more men. Basically, the Union loses about a third of its men, and the Confederacy is going to lose over half. So the significance is at this point, Lee's invasion of the North will be permanently stopped. The Confederacy will never again enter the North. It will never again enter Union territory. And not only that, but Lee's army is now permanently weakened. It's really not an issue. Well, basically, Lee is not going to be able to really win significant battles after this, but that's not going to keep him from fighting. Because Lee knows that so long as he fights, even if he can't win like he used to, if he continues to fight and continues to drag the war out, he might be able to make Lincoln's popularity weaken to the point where the Northern citizens will again stop supporting the war and maybe vote Lincoln out of office. So this battle will be the turning point in the Eastern theater of the war. There you see the fighting that took place on Cemetery Ridge. There you see that stone wall. But again, by this point, the Confederacy was so weakened in its advance to the stone wall that they weren't able to win. And so in the end, Vicksburg and Gettysburg, they have the people of Vicksburg surrender on July the 4th, one day after Lee had lost at Gettysburg. So these twin losses for the Confederacy are going to turn the momentum in the favor of the Union, at least militarily. And the Confederacy is not going to be able to score any more major victories in this war. However, this happens in 1863. The war continues on until 1865. So for another couple years, you're going to see the Confederacy keep fighting despite the fact that they're losing, despite the fact that their citizens are starving. And again, the idea is that if they can drag this war out, then maybe they can get the Northern citizens against Lincoln enough to get the war, get them to vote Lincoln out of office. So despite this major victory, these two major victories for Lincoln, Lincoln's going to have to find a way to get Northern support back on board with the war, because whenever pictures of this battle get back to the Northern citizens, they are not going to have the stomach for the pictures that they're seeing. For example, pictures like this one. So Lincoln again is going to have to find a way to boost the Northern morale. And what he does this time is he does it with words. So the first time he boosted Northern morale, he does it with the Emancipation Proclamation, adding a moral cost to this war. This time he's going to make one of the most famous speeches in American history. So shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, the federal government is going to dedicate the battlefield as a national battlefield, a national monument. And at this dedication ceremony, Abraham Lincoln is going to make what's known as the Gettysburg Address. And he's going to make a speech about the battle and about the war in general, and also about the country in general. This is the famous speech that begins with the phrase 7 years ago. Well, 7 years before 1863 would have been 1776. So he's going to be referencing the Declaration of Independence. And I'm not going to read you the entire address. It's not a very long address, but I will give you the major themes of it. So one of the things that he's going to say is he's going to say that basically 7 years ago, the nation was founded by the founding fathers on the notion that all men are created equal. Remember that phrase from the Declaration of Independence that keeps coming back? Here it is again, even in the Civil War. And then he's going to say we are now in this war to see if basically we can uphold this ideal that all men are created equal. So he's bringing in the Declaration of Independence. He's bringing in the idea of equality in terms of races. So he's going to say that the war now has to be won to make sure that the goal that was set by the founding fathers, intentionally or not, that all men were created equal, we must continue fighting this war to ensure that the founding ideals are fulfilled. Because if we don't win this war at this point, he argues, then the Declaration of Independence will be forgotten. And the idea that all men are created equal will be forgotten. So the war must be won to fulfill basically the vision of the founding fathers. Interesting side note, there were a few people at this time still alive that had been around at both the time of the American Revolution and of the Civil War. And then basically he's going to also say that if that's not a good enough reason, then think about all the people that have died already. If we give up now, he says, then all the soldiers that have died up to this point will have died in vain, will have died for no reason. So we are not at the point where we can turn back anymore. We are at the point where we have to finish the job, or what do we say to the families of the soldiers that have already died? So again, the three major points of the Gettysburg Address is that the country was founded on the idea that all men are created equal, and now we are engaged in a, quote, great civil war to see if this vision can be fulfilled. And then finally, he's going to say that we must make sure that none of those that have died in vain. So again, we're fulfilling the vision of the founding fathers. We must fight to make sure that vision is attained. so that freedom and equality is given to all. And at this point, that would also include slaves, because this is after the Emancipation Proclamation. And finally, we must make sure that those that have not died in vain. So we have to finish out the war for them. Will this boost Northern morale? Yes. Will it boost Northern morale for very long? No, because Lee is still around, and Lee is still going to keep fighting, even though he's been permanently weakened. That doesn't stop him from fighting. But this will, at least for a time, boost Northern morale. Okay, so let's get into some of the most vicious fighting that happens in the Civil War that a lot of people don't talk about or know about, and that will be what's known as the Wilderness Campaign. So remember that I said that Grant, General Grant, who is willing to fight and lose men if necessary, he is the best general that Lincoln has, remember. Grant is about to take on Lee head to head. And it's going to be known as a series of battles known as the Wilderness Campaign. And what Grant's going to be trying to do is basically Grant's going to be trying to get Lee to surrender. And Lee is going to be trying to hold on as long as he can, defend the capital, Richmond, as long as he can, drag the war out until the election of 1864, and see if he can keep the war going so much that Lincoln loses. So this, again, is known generally as the Wilderness Campaign. Grant is going to be in Tennessee by this point, and he is going to win in Tennessee, and then at that point, Lincoln is going to call him to the Eastern Theater to take on Lee. So now you finally have the best general on both sides, the best generals on both sides fighting against one another. However, they are not fighting both at full strength. Grant at this point is stronger than Lee, but that doesn't keep Lee from fighting. Lee is a genius, militarily speaking, and Lee can keep these fights going, although he isn't doing a very good job of winning the battles anymore. He is still holding off Grant long enough to keep the war dragging on. At this point, Grant's right-hand man, who does not die during the war, is going to be left in charge of finishing the job in Tennessee, and then pretty soon after that, General Sherman is going to leave Tennessee and is going to start his famous march through Georgia, known as his March to the Sea, where he basically just breaks and burns and destroys everything he comes across. More on Sherman's march in the next lecture. Okay, back to Virginia. So now Grant and Lee are going to be fighting, and Grant is going to keep the pressure on Lee. He's going to attack him. Lee is going to retreat. Then Grant attacks him again, and Lee's going to retreat. But Lee doesn't surrender, and Lee does fight back. And again, the idea for Lee is that if he keeps this going, he might turn the Northern citizens against Grant again and against Abraham Lincoln again. And remember that dragging a war out can turn the people against a war. Look what happened when Nathanael Greene was fighting against Cornwallis and dragging out the battles in the Carolinas during the American Revolution. So again, Lee is going to be fighting. This is going to be some of the most brutal fighting that takes place in the entire Civil War, but he is going to hold on as long as he can. And Grant is going to be losing a lot of men in the process. But Grant is going to do what's necessary in the end to get Lee to surrender. But remember, the more men that Grant loses, the more that the Northern morale sinks, and so do the chances of Lincoln getting reelected. So again, what Grant is intending to do is basically grind what's left of Lee's army down until Lee surrenders. Ultimately, this will work, although it'll take longer than expected, and Lee almost drags this war out long enough to get Lincoln voted out of office. There's going to be one battle, and I believe it was known as the Battle of the Wilderness, that gets so intense that the gunfire and the gunpowder ignite a forest fire. So imagine, and that's what's shown in the picture there, imagine a battle that gets so intense that a forest fire breaks out. So not only are soldiers fighting against each other, but they're also trying to escape the flames of a forest fire. And you have these very nasty stories of men that are laying there injured, and then the fire gets so close to them that it ignites the bullets that are in their belts, and basically they get killed by their own exploding bullets. their own exploding gunpowder. Some of them are burning to death. There are stories of men that when the fire, if they could not walk anymore because they were so injured and the fire was approaching, that men were killing themselves rather than burning alive or burning to death. So again, this is very brutal. The battle in the wilderness that involves the forest fire is one of the ones that was so bad that even Grant, who was known for being able to kind of psychologically withstand carnage and was willing to lose men, this even causes Grant to lose his composure. That's how nasty this gets. As the wilderness campaign continues, Grant is going to send troops to the Virginia town of Petersburg, and at Petersburg, he is going to put that city under siege because that city had the only railroad left that led into Richmond. And if he could take out Petersburg, then there would be no supply line left for Richmond. And then Richmond could be basically starved out, sort of like Vicksburg was. And this does prove to be successful in the end. So with that siege, he does manage to cut off supplies to the Confederate capital. He will eventually go to Richmond and basically destroy that city. That doesn't happen until a little bit later on. So at this point, remember that the war has not been won. The American people in the northern states see that this war has not yet been won, despite Vicksburg falling, despite the victory at Gettysburg, despite the fact that Lee is permanently weakened, despite the fact that the Anaconda Plan is well fulfilled by this point, despite all of these things militarily that are working in the Union's favor, and despite the fact that the Confederacy is going broke without its slaves and without its supplies, because people are still dying, because the war is still dragging on, the Union citizens are starting again to turn against Abraham Lincoln and against Grant. So if you'll see there in the notes, Grant is successful in grinding down Lee's army. He is on the verge of capturing Richmond and causing Lee to surrender. But the problem for Grant and the problem for Lincoln is that Lee hasn't surrendered. And if Lee were to surrender, that would signal the end of the war. Or if there's some other major event that would happen, maybe the destruction of a major southern city, that might signal the war was near. But at this point, that hadn't happened. That will come. That will happen in the next lecture. In the next lecture, you'll see the destruction of Atlanta, Georgia, and you will see the surrender of Lee. But it hasn't happened yet. And in the meantime, Northern morale is going to continue to plummet because Grant is going to suffer more casualties on just his side of this fighting than were lost in the entire Battle of Gettysburg. So he's going to be losing on his side 55,000 men over the course of the Wilderness Campaign. Lee continues to fight despite the fact that he's losing men as well. And so here we are. We're in 1864. Lincoln is going to be willing to face re-election. And that's important to note that he's even willing to face a re-election because during the middle of a civil war, he could have suspended elections. But that proves, I think, that he was not a dictator and that he wanted to keep the democratic process going. And so in 1864, despite the fact that Northern morale had fallen yet again, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, even after all the military victories, even after the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln is facing re-election in 1864 and expecting to be voted out of office. So in the final lecture in which I talk about the battles of the Civil War, which will be the next one, we will go into that lecture knowing that the war is pretty much being won by the Union Army on the battlefield, but there are heavy losses. And as a result of Lee not surrendering, and as a result of the war dragging on, the Northern citizens are poised to vote Lincoln out of office. And if they vote him out of office, the next president that comes in might allow the Confederacy to secede and keep their slavery, or they might allow them to rejoin the Union and keep their slaves, and basically undo a lot of the work that had been done by Lincoln during the Civil War. So here we are, we're on the verge of the 1864 election. The Union is winning militarily, but Lincoln is losing politically, and we will see in the next lecture how the war ends and how Lincoln survives the election of 1864, and then the aftermath of the war and its impact on the nation.